Hi, folks. Trisha Curtis, CEO of PetroNerds and host of the PetroNerds podcast. Welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. It is this is actually part 2. This is a double header. So this is we just recorded episode 43 this morning with Tellurian's head of strategy, Renee Pirrong, and we are going to continue that episode on today. So I'm just going to introduce that a little bit because we broke it into because it was a quite lengthy and really great discussion. So this is the second part of the doubleheader. This is part 2. It is still Monday, April 4th, 2022. When we recorded this episode in the morning, oil prices, WTI was 101.80, Brent was 106.36, and nat gas, Henry Hub was 580. At the time, TTF or Dutch oil prices, Dutch natural gas prices in Europe. The European benchmark for nat gas prices was about $36. So that's the timestamp, April 4th, 2022. That was episode 43 that recorded. This is episode 44. And I do have the benefit of given that I know what we're talking about because I'm introducing the episode, is that a couple things that Renee and I really get into, and that's that really getting into China and this dialogue on China. And we don't completely agree on LNG and why exactly China is importing. We saw this rise in LNG, which is great. I think it's a really good conversation for the listeners, for you to hear some different perspectives. And furthermore, I think there's we also beyond China, we talk about the European energy crisis. And the benefit of today already happening is that two things happened today. And that's that, we didn't talk in the last episode about the lockdowns taking place in China. So I do think something pulling down oil prices in addition to the SPR release, which was big, but I don't believe the SPR release is helping the market quite as much as folks think it is. I really do. I think the lockdowns in China are very serious. I mean, you actually have children being removed from their parents in Shanghai and other places are reportedly. So that's quite scary and a big problem. But in addition to this conversation that we're talking about China and we're talking about the European energy crisis. So I'm going to go ahead and add this that, and Varus came out with their newsfeed this evening, and folks probably saw the new Fortress facility of the Fast LNG project off of Louisiana. So looking to rapidly accelerate development of LNG and add more in the Gulf Coast. I think to me, this is an example of our previous conversation I had with Renee of that the market is going to move relatively fast on this. We'll see if this is, folks are actually capable and they can get all the equipment and supplies given the supply chain bottlenecks that we are seeing. However, I would also like to add is that Cnoc is looking to sell their North Sea assets. So they got this when they bought Nexen, the Canadian company, and those assets. Now they're looking to sell that for $3 billion. I think this is very interesting because what Renee and I talk about within this podcast is China's energy policy, what they're doing right now, and food and energy security. And what I get into a little bit of their current dual circulation strategy, which is really about doubling down on what's on their domestic economy and working on their exports, but being very careful on who they're actually trading with. And I think that the fact that Cnoc, the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company, is what CNOOC stands for, and the fact that they're looking to sell assets and they're talking about looking towards. So I believe Reuters had talked to someone within China and said that part of those sale was getting out of Western assets and looking more toward Guyana and Uganda. Now, this is really serious because this is what I'm sort of talking about in the podcast and alluding to is that China is looking to really sort of decouple itself in many ways from the West. I think if you were listening to CNBC World tonight or Bloomberg tonight, you were hearing things about Evergrande. You're hearing things about this continual and strong relationship with China and Russia, which is something we talk about in this podcast, and I think is really serious. So when you see that Cnoc is looking to sell assets and that the folks in China are reporting that they are looking at Guyana and Uganda, you're talking about you're talking about Africa and you're talking about Brazil, places that China has a lot of influence and places that this is not under the realm of Western rule. So I just think that's really important to sort of encapsulate this. So without further ado, Renee is going to start talking in just a second, and she's going to continue her conversation from last week that we had. And this is really going to be a conversation on China and the European energy crisis. So thank you guys so much for listening. And really hope you enjoy it, and talk soon. Bye. Yeah,
or 2
and
billion people out of poverty.
Yeah, no, and those are all excellent points, and it gets us to pivot into our. We can close on this on the final topic of China, but I think it's really important that people realize too is that, and I will beat this drum of not calling them fossil fuels and calling them crude oil, natural gas, and coal, and also beat the drum of U.S. oil and gas producers and folks in the energy space in general. CEOs of public companies have not done a good job of defending what they do in this industry. They have completely leaned in and pandered to the ESG push that is utter crap. When we're talking about ESG and we're talking about human lives and we're talking about social and governance, we're focusing on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions when you're not focusing on the social and the governance aspect. You don't have a diverse board. You don't even, not even just a diverse board, but actually talking about the human piece. I mean, the human capital piece of where are your investments? I mean, look at the portfolios of these companies and where their investments are at. And the ESG thing is just hugely important to me especially when we're talking about China. And there is a single country in this whole thing that stands to gain a lot, is gaining. I mean, China has probably profited the most from this war in Ukraine. And I don't say that lightly, folks. You guys can pull up the actual data of you can look at the imports on a dollar basis of China's imports and their inflation in the month of February. And you can see also what they're pulling in from Russia. Their imports from Russia skyrocketed in the month of February. Again, the war started on February 24th. Their decree or their statement that they put out together that was on Russia and China, that was February 4th. The war started on February 24th. Imports surged during the month of February, and their inflation came down, and that means that they basically were getting a discount already in the month of February for these goods. The first day of the war, they said they're going to continue to increase grain imports from Russia. And Renee's point on this energy security is huge. I take a little bit of different perspective, and that's because I've dug into, the 14th five-year plan and a lot of Chinese documents and text. And food and energy security, it's one of their 6 pillars that they put out actually during 2020, which is interesting. So they took a big pivot on their dual circulation strategy of beefing up the domestic consumption side of the business and also, or consumption side of the country, and then exporting products. And the food and energy security piece is interesting because they dealt with firsthand the energy security problem because of the things I was pointing out, and you're well aware of they have a lot of hydropower. China has more renewable power than actually most countries of the world. I mean, they have a ton of solar and wind power that's not efficient. And so there's a couple recent podcasts I listened to that were fantastic of all their recent policies that they've done. So this is very interesting on the energy security. So if you're on the renewable side and you're getting really excited about seeing all the wind and solar being installed in China, you need to be very careful with that, because it is one, to build out their business, the wind and solar business, and they do have a lot of it. So back to what I was just saying. So they have a ton of wind and solar. They're building it out. They're exporting it. So most of it's built in the province of Xinjiang, which is riddled with human rights abuses and internment camps and forced labor and re-education camps between 1 and 3 million Uyghur Muslims. And we do know that most of the polysilicon, most of the solar panels being made in China are being made in the province of Xinjiang, likely from forced labor, which is a huge reason why the costs are so ridiculously low, and why they've been able to flood the market in the last few years, in addition to stealing the technology from Germany and then building it up from 2017 onward. There's all very clear dots and correlations to that. So that was flooding the market. And one country that stands to gain the most from Europe reducing their imports of coal, or reducing their imports, of coal and natural gas, but largely of natural gas, and really doubling down on the energy transition on wind and solar, China stands to import or gain the most. And I think it was Bloomberg Green put out that it was a 15% increase just this year, I think, in imports from China for solar. And I think that's a significant reality of that. China is benefiting from the imports. They're getting huge discounts on coal, grain, and oil from Russia. And the food and energy security thing is really important because so energy security, I think last year when the coal production when we had the big issue with coal, right, where they didn't have enough coal, and everybody said, okay, well, they had dropped their imports from Australia. So when Australia asked about the origins of the COVID virus, they banned imports of coal from Australia and wine, and that wasn't a ton, but it was about 12%. And they were also declining output from mines, not because of environmental standards necessarily. It was because they had a lot of mines and mine accidents, and so they had closed a lot of these smaller mines. And then they had the shortage of electricity and power. You had cities without power for months in the fall of last year. And so they ramped up coal production like crazy. And part of they also emphasize supply chains a lot in their reports. So it's this redundancy. And so when we think about food and energy security, it's really about creating redundancy. And we think about energy in China, when you're adding all these renewables, they have a mandate now to produce more coal than they need. So all the domestic coal output. So they're ramping up coal production, like you said, like crazy. So they will be supplying their own coal. They are a coal powerhouse. Lo and behold, they produce a massive amount of coal and have a lot of reserves in the province of Xinjiang. They also have a lot of oil and natural gas there as well. So producing all this stuff. And then when they build out their energy, right now you hear on the renewable side and the energy transition side, a lot of people are talking about this massive build out of wind and solar. And they're doing this in tandem with coal. So they're building out excess of coal-fired power generation capacity with the wind and solar, and they are admitting that it's not cost-effective at all, which tells you something. The intermittency of the wind and solar has to have the coal to back it up. It's not being backed up by natural gas. There's a whole different reason for that. It's not being backed up by natural gas because they don't have the natural gas. So they're backing it up with coal. So this is not about reducing emissions. This is about energy security. This is about redundancy in the system. And they want to make sure that they have this electricity to have redundancy in supply chains. I think this is a little, I would argue that yes, they want quality of life and well-being for their people, but there's 600 million people in rural China that, I don't think have access to stable power supplies necessarily. But all that being stable, you need power to keep people happy. So right now, you literally have a mandate for building redundancy and power, renewable. So you have lots of wind, lots of solar being built out in tandem with coal. So we're seeing a surge in all that. And when you're using the wind and solar, you're not using the coal. So you get to build up that extra, that little bumper of extra coal supplies. And so that is a benefit when you're building those out in tandem together. And I think they've also recognized the cost of there's a cost of intermittency and there's a cost of transmission. So you're building out the wind and solar close, and then you have to building out the transmission side for renewables is very expensive. And so they're sort of eating the cost in this in a lot of ways to both build out the sector, I think to build out the renewable sector in China, so they can continue to export, and it's a profitable sector, and they want that to be very prosperous, but also because this is an energy security space. So it's multifold. There's a lot going on here. We can't obviously probably completely digest that, but there's a reason I think you and I have talked about, and I want you to hone in on, is the natural gas imports. So we've seen natural gas imports for China surge. And I think partly that's because they were complying with the trade agreement. They were trying to comply with previous trade agreements under Trump. And those were dominated in dollars, not in volumes. So they did have to ramp up the imports for natural gas to sort of try to comply with some of those trade agreements. And they were very short term. I mean, it's like, I think they're using natural gas to heat homes. I don't think they're using it to power. And so it's to me, it's a little bit of, it's available, the prices were right, we can get it, we're stockpiling, things like that, as opposed to really integrating this into our grid. And I know that was a lot, but you can handle it. So you're smart. So I love, feel free to take what you want there. And
all right. So I guess first, here's a fun fact. We looked at Chinese renewable capacity, I think it was about a year ago. And one surprising thing we saw from the data was the utilization rate of Chinese wind and solar was far lower than the global average. And we
Absolutely.
figured out that the part of the reason was because of lack of transmission capacity, right? So you're right. You have to distinguish between generation and transmission. You can't have one without the other. That goes for the US and Europe as well, by the way. But we've definitely seen that within the data in China. So that's one thing. I think I would also say I disagree with you a little bit on the trade tariffs issue. Chinese demand for LNG has been insatiable, and they're willing to take it from wherever. And so,
but only recently. What's the number? So 2020 they were 30 BCF. 2019 they were 30 BCF a day market, right? They produce about 15 BCF a day. They were importing about 15 BCF a day, and that's edged up in the last 2 years by a few BCF a day, right?
Well, I'll put it this way. If they could produce all the gas themselves, they absolutely would, right? But
Yes.
to your point, they have to import it. So last year, they imported about 80 million tons of LNG. Again, excuse me, I think in million tons, and I'm not great at dividing by 7 in my head.
No, but my point is that if we're exporting, our export capacity is pushing 13 BCF a day, and that they're importing a little bit more than that. But what they import and with their whole market is just double of our export capacity. So we consume about 80 BCF a day in the US. Mm-hmm. And China, in the biggest energy consumer in the world, the second largest economy in the world, is a drop in the bucket on natural gas because they don't produce it. And so I really think people have to be careful about when you see this surge. And I do think it is a surge, like it is an insatiable appetite, but it's backed by these things that we've been talking about: the food and energy security, the recent volatility they've had, supply chain issues. That the surge is not necessarily. I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think China will continue to expose themselves to geopolitical volatility by importing LNG. As long as they can, they will. But I don't think they want to be exposed. So that surge, I don't think is a long-term trend that they're saying, hey, we want global LNG from Western democratic countries. I don't think that's I truthfully don't think that's a long-term trend. So that surge, I'm curious that you guys see that surge and it's an insatiable appetite. Where do you think about what's driving the surge? Is it the near-term stuff, and how are they using it? Like from the power, it doesn't seem to be like they're using it very much from the power side. It does seem the heating home side, which would help offset coal. People still use coal in heating homes in
Yep.
massive amount of China. So that would help from a pollution standpoint significantly as well.
Okay, so yes, let's talk about the demand side first, and then we'll talk about contracting and supply and where they're getting their LNG from. So the surge of LNG demand in China really started in earnest in sort of winter 2017, when the government mandates to convert a lot of homes from consuming coal to cleaner fuels, whether that's electricity or gas, started coming into effect. And given the lack of available resources at that time, they pulled hard on LNG imports to switch about 7 million homes per year in just northern China alone from coal to natural gas, primarily for blue skies and human health reasons, right? We used to burn coal in our houses in the UK. Remember the chimney sweeps in Mary Poppins? That was why. So China has been embarking on a plan to switch from coal to cleaner fuels, primarily gas. So about 7 million homes a year. So a lot of the demand is coming from the residential, commercial, and also the industrial sector. We can't ignore the fact that the industrial sector is one of the primary consumers of LNG. But to your point, it really is not today a huge part of their power sector. Coal and renewables, coal in particular, to a lesser extent, renewables, including hydro, represent the majority of their power grid. That's, to your point, an issue with energy security. They are looking to build more CCGT and more gas-fired turbines close to LNG terminals on the coast, again, as sort of a blue skies campaign. But that is not the primary demand pull for LNG in China.
And that's also not, I wouldn't just say it's actually not big in their 14th five-year plan, building out gas-fired power generation is not a big component of that plan. It's not even, it's kind of a footnote, if that.
Yeah, I also think you have to sort of remember how, obviously China is a huge country, right? So what's true in one region is not necessarily true in the other. A lot of the gas demand is happening at the coast because that's where
Absolutely.
the more affluent regions are. And those regions are willing to pay a little bit more for LNG or for imported gas to clean their air, right? Okay, so that's the demand side of things. It's mostly rescom, it's mostly industrial, it's to a lesser extent gas in the power sector. But on a annual growth perspective, gas demand for power is growing, and also transportation. LNG and trucking is a small wedge, but a growing wedge in urban areas, primarily in northern China, for demand. So, and also it's important to keep in mind the scale of how big China is, right? So, for 40 BCM, or basically 4 BCF a day, of switching from coal to gas, that's equivalent to basically the entire size of Driftwood LNG. So 27 million tons. These are big numbers. So even if you have a small change in coal to gas, it's a big number for LNG, right? So I'm not saying that we will necessarily have a 1% switch, but even if you have a small one, these are big numbers, right?
Yeah, and they're big. That's the point. They're big, and they're especially big because they're coming from a low base as well.
Exactly. And the other thing is, so if China is importing about 80 million tons of LNG today, and that has been growing at a very high rate. I can't remember the actual growth rate in my head right now over the last 5 years, but it's growing at I think double-digit perspective. They also are trying to bring more gas in via the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, and the Power of Siberia 1 pipeline is slowly ramping up. And both of those pipelines take gas from Gazprom via sort of the northern region, where most of the demand, primarily for home heating, because it's a colder climate, that's where most of the demand comes from. So even if you did have the full 50 BCM or 5 BCF a day Power of Siberia 2 pipeline come online in the next 5 years, which in my opinion is probably a pretty aggressive timescale, given the fact that it took at least 10 years to build Power of Siberia 1, you still have a substantial amount of LNG demand pull from all of those sectors that I just mentioned. So, power is important, but it's definitely not the only driver. And then I guess finally, your point about getting LNG from Western democracies, I take your point. However, China over the last year, and really over the last 6 months, has been on a spending spree, tying up most of their new LNG contracts from US LNG projects in particular. And that is a function of, one, lack of other alternatives. Prior to this crisis, there were only 3 countries in the world that could supply low cost gas and LNG at scale. And that is Qatar, Russia, and the United States. Okay. So with the perspective from Russia, you've had basically 70 million tons of planned liquefaction capacity wiped off the map just from lack of funding. They don't have access to Western technology. Those projects are never coming online. You have Baltic LNG and Arctic LNG 2 projects that are currently under construction. The former Baltic LNG, I don't think will ever come online. Arctic LNG 2, it's a toss-up, and it will probably be delayed. And both of them will be in a much more precarious position given the sanctions and lack of access to Western technology for equipment. So that's a bit of a tangent, but basically Russia is no longer one of the big 3 in terms of incremental LNG supply that can come to the market. Okay. And then you have Qatar, which is currently building its expansion of about, I think a little bit more than 30 million tons, and that's under construction, and that will come to the market, and that's desperately needed by the market. So really, if you're China and you're looking around, where else am I going to get the LNG that I need to, clean my air and, meet the gas demand that I have committed to growing over the next few decades? I'm not going to be getting as much from Australia. There's really not any new projects that are coming out of Australia anyways. Your only options are really the United States. And they have indeed committed to substantial amount of new long-term contracts, because they understand the need for new liquefaction capacity. The United States is a low-cost provider, and it's one of the places that they know they can tie up those volumes and get for the long term. And then finally, I would also argue that if you think of the global LNG market as a giant bathtub, and there's a lot of different spigots and there's a lot of different drains, we've seen that, for instance, with the tariffs and sort of the trade war under the Trump administration, even though China said that it didn't want US LNG, they still manage to get it from other places, right? So you have to think about this on a total balances perspective. And I am convinced that their demand will continue to grow. They have indicated a willingness to buy it from US projects. And ultimately, even if there are some sort of trade spats, the LNG will flow to where it's needed, and the markets will clear, as we've seen that happen in the past.
I mean, that's all great explanations. I know we need to close this podcast, and we'll probably have to break this into two now because it's went long. But
we haven't even gotten to Europe, and that's the really crazy stuff these days.
Well, we've been talking about Europe in context of the actual volumes needed to go, or the moving around the volumes. But the China side is. China's opportunistic in everything that they do. There's in a single transaction or, increasing volumes of LNG from the U.S. is a really great way to, one, I do think volumes increasing, contracted or not contracted, is a part of trade compliance that they were doing. And they need it. I don't believe, yes, Blue Skies campaign, everything. It's an additional source of energy, and they're going to get it, and they can still get it. So they'll get it from anywhere. And yes, they can get it from the U.S., so let's tie it up. That also puts the U.S. in a really precarious position when they want to if they want to sanction China in the future, that they're selling to China, and China knows exactly that. That's how they work with every single country, is they tie themselves up economically to where it's harder to disentangle themselves. So if you're China, you would absolutely tangle yourself up on the LNG front in the U.S. so that the U.S. believes that they're beholden to you and they won't find a market. It is not smart, I think, for LNG exporters to get tied down on exclusive contracts with China, because I think that as we're seeing with Russia, and as we've seen the commentary about these fears around China, there's a lot of tying of that in together. I also think that it's a little bit the naiveness on Russia and China is prominent in the market. So no, people always say, we hear about it on the market now, is that, they'll go the China-Taiwan stuff. That's not where I'm going with this at all. But the relationship and tie between Russia and China is extremely strong, and the energy and food security thing is really real. And those have come into tandem over the last few years together. The war wasn't planned overnight. These things weren't devised overnight. They didn't construct their agreements with each other overnight. And so, yes, it's taken forever on the Power of Siberia. We don't know the terms of it. We don't actually know how much China is paying. But I think China is able to give Russia, they're able to front load them money. They're explaining. You have Chinese professors on TV, on CNBC World in the evenings, and when they talk about, what about China's investments in Russia, and they say, look, this is humanitarian. We are literally providing humanitarian good by continuing to transact with Russia and making sure their people have food and making sure this is a humanitarian good. That's literally how Chinese professors are explaining, why they're continuing to work with China, or why they're continuing to work with Russia. So they're getting cheap goods. And so when you think about it, and a lot of the investment is, when you look at the 5-year plan and other documents, is on the northern border, right? So Russia and China in that northern border region, where they can move both people and flows of energy. But if Russia's not exporting, if their Arctic LNG export facilities are curbed and they're not exporting abroad to other people, they're going to have one market to export that to, and that's going to be both pipe and LNG to China. So yeah, China. I wouldn't read into anything China does from a global LNG perspective into what they will do in the future, or an indication of what they're doing at home from an environmental perspective or a people perspective. It should be viewed from a relatively opportunistic lens. And they also are every bit of LNG that is not exported out of Russia, to the extent that they have the capacity and money and ability to actually produce it at home and it doesn't decline, all of that will be going to China, all of it at a discount. And so all those LNG import facilities and everything on the coast are going to see likely we'll see increased volumes of Russian gas. And Russia has made it a clear pivot over the last several years to pivot to Asia. And we're seeing India continue to buy crude oil at a discount from Russia as well. So, lots of countries within Asia are seeing this, they've been tied into both China and Russia, and that they're sort of in this situation. So I would say, caveat my comment about not buying it from Western democratic countries. I just think it's a near-term opportunistic thing. It makes total sense when you do it. But the fact that we aren't sort of viewing the Chinese political regime the same way we should be, the way they run their country from a domestic policy to foreign policy agenda, it's more similar to Russia than people realize. I'm not saying they're the same autocratic styles, very different. It's a huge economy, but I think we have to be very, very careful about forecasting their demands, nature, and structure off of history, because it's just not from an energy standpoint. And they tend to, throw spaghetti on the wall, see what sticks. And from an energy perspective, it's always been all in. It's everything. They literally have the all of the above strategy, and they want all the energy they can, and they want all the redundancy. And LNG is natural gas is a huge component of that. I think they've really struggled to produce natural gas at home. They have it, but actually struggling to produce it takes a lot of work and innovation and technology and ingenuity on the shale side and the unconventional side. They do have a lot of it. Again, they have a lot of oil, gas, coal, and just rich in natural resources in the northern parts of their country, in the province of Xinjiang. And so there's a lot going on. I think we can sort of table that, but there's a lot going on in that space. The fact that they have increased LNG is, yes, they've done it, but they're such a drop in the bucket for what they should be for the size of their country. So if they were really trying to green up their country, if they were really trying to do it, they would have doubled down on natural gas a long time ago. And then the fact that they didn't is simply because they have the coal, and it is about opening themselves up geopolitically. There's a lot of risk to those. To bringing that in. So if you think about where they can get it from a secure standpoint, and it's still, I think it's still relatively globally, we're talking about relatively smaller volumes from. Now, I'm not saying it's huge for the 5 BCF a day, whatever it is, a few BCF a day here is meaningful, but it's relatively small volumes in the grand scheme of things. With that,
for China, I will say yes.
For China, yes.
Small in the grand scheme of China, large in the grand scheme of world LNG balances.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
and with that,
it just depends on which hat you're on.
Absolutely. With that, I think we've beaten the horse on China. There's a lot we could continue talking about China for a long time. I think on the, to close, and I am going to break this up into two podcasts, but I think if the European side and the European crisis, and we talked about this to the extent that we were talking about how the original crisis sort of evolved, right, from the nature of the winter in Asia, and the spring in Europe, and the drawdown, and we were talking about supply and demand and where it was coming from. But I think right now, I think the last thing to actually quantify the volumes, and I would try to. I mean, we were talking about the 15 BCM and the 50 BCM, and the ability for Europe to actually import liquefied natural gas. Obviously, everyone's talking about it now. Every country in Europe wants this natural gas immediately, and they want to secure it for the future. We have countries that have historically actually built out the facilities. I mean, if you look at a map, you can find this online and you can Google it. There are a lot of LNG import facilities within Europe. Countries that were ahead of the curve were Spain. Poland has built out a lot of liquefied natural gas import facilities. But I think, you and I have talked about this previously. The ability, sort of short term, the floating vessels is an interesting concept to me of like how quickly that could be ramped up. Obviously, there's going to be capacity issues there. But just on a nameplate sort of capacity, three things. There's a nameplate sort of capacity of what they can actually do, if it's being maxed out, and if they could get more. So I'm just saying, theorizing an incremental, another BCF a day out of Qatar, another BCF a day Australia. Everybody's pumping above their weight. You're giving the market signals to natural gas producers all over the world to produce more. But it's that, what's the nameplate capacity now, and how, the feasibility side. And I have my opinions on this of can we add more floating storage, and can we get more or is this simply we're killing ourselves now? We're incrementally going to do all we can, and it's really going to take 18 months of sort of getting this rejiggered to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, so I think, to answer your first question, nominal regas capacity in all of Europe, right? So that includes the UK, that includes non-EU countries, that also includes Turkey, is 252 BCMA, which is about 25 BCF a day. Okay. But when you look at all of Europe, you have to basically I tend to break it into sort of three major regions. The first is Iberia, which has about 60 BCMA of regas capacity. So that would be Portugal and Spain. But that's really an LNG island if you consider it within the whole European context, right? There's a tiny little pipeline that goes to France. But if you're really trying to wean yourself off of Russian gas, Iberian capacity isn't going to get you there because they don't consume any anyways. And there's no way to get that extra capacity to the countries that do consume Russian gas anywhere in the near term. Although speaking of policy U-turns, France and Spain are now considering expanding that pipeline capacity between their two.
I was going to say, I bet every pipeline that can be expanded that's in the works at the moment.
So that's one. So that's Iberia. Two, you have Italy and Turkey, both of which get a substantial portion of their total gas supply from Russia. And that's another 60 BCMA, or about 6 BCF a day. And then finally, the big piece that all eyes are on right now is Northwest Europe. So that would include the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland. I include the Baltics in that, and Northwest France. And that is about 104 BCMA. So it's clearly the largest capacity in Europe from a regas perspective. Again, for your listeners, about 10 BCF a day of regas capacity in Northwest Europe, where a lot of the gas that comes in from Russia is going. And Germany in particular is a big country that has a lot of Russian gas supply and gas demand, and not a single regas terminal, which, again, speaking of policy U-turns, I don't think there's been any more dramatic change in policy than Germany over the past month, particularly over energy policy, but also over, obviously, military policy and funding of NATO.
But can we just pause for 1 second right there? So this is where, so when you're looking at that map, and I love the way you're bucking into regions, because I look at the maps of the terminals and the pipelines, and it's that those pipelines are always they're there, right? So it's like, so from that perspective, we know we only have a little bit of pipeline capacity so you could import more into Spain, but the ability to move it out, through up would be difficult. Okay. You do have the pipelines though in place in Britain and other parts of Europe. So the ability for those to be reversing flows, expanding flows, building connectors, that is theoretically capable. I mean, I know it might not be on the forefront of everybody's, certain people are thinking about that, but from a technical capacity, if they have the pipe, are people thinking about that in terms of, okay, bring as much LNG as possible in the places we can and build out this near-term, this infrastructure as quickly as possible. And then we I wouldn't say repurpose the pipelines, but flows need to probably maneuver around, but they do have a lot of pipe in the ground.
Correct. So let's take the UK and the Bacton interconnector for a first example. So the UK represents a big bulk of Northwest Europe's regas capacity. And a lot of that was actually built by Qatar, because the UK gets a lot of its LNG supply from Qatar. But there is one pipeline that goes from the UK into the EU, into the Belgium, I think it's called I can't remember the exact term, but basically the Belgian gas system region. And that can take more gas capacity. As I looked at the numbers recently, and to my surprise, I actually found that pipeline flows from the UK to continental Europe were actually running at really low rates. So I think that, theoretically, you could import a lot more LNG into the UK and send it into Europe. A bit of a head scratcher to me as to why that's not happening now, but maybe that's a conversation for a future podcast. So that's from a short-term perspective. From like a short to medium-term perspective, you've probably heard a lot about FSRUs being deployed as a sort of near-term stopgap to expand regas capacity. Now, FSRU stands for Floating Storage Regas Units. And basically those are LNG carriers that you put some pots and pans on them and you retool them. Either you retool an old LNG carrier to regasify LNG, or you build a new FSRU. Companies like Accelerate do that. So basically ships that can both ship and regasify LNG into a system.
I can only imagine their phone calls going. They're like their business is going through the roof. This is like, yeah.
And they're also, I
Accelerate.
think Accelerate is actually going through an IPO process right now. So
I'm going to need to
exciting
get them
times
on the
over there.
podcast. But okay, yeah. So
Yeah. Um,
FSRUs are, in theory, we could deploy them.
Correct. And those actually are pretty straightforward to install. Basically, you need to build a jetty and you need to locate the FSRU, obviously, close to other pipeline infrastructure, right? You don't want to just sort of send it into nothing. So the location matters. But for all intents and purposes, you can technically deploy an FSRU under the absolute best conditions. I think the record has been 18 months from the start of proposal to actually hooking it up to the terminal as a terminal and regasifying LNG. And that actually happened in Turkey. I looked at the data recently and it appears there's upwards of 40 total FSRUs currently existing and in the order book. A lot of those are already tied up as terminals around the world, right? So,
and you have quite a few of
for
those in Europe
instance,
or in Africa, right?
You do have some in Africa, more Middle East, MENA region, but a lot of them actually are in Europe, right? So one of them is in Croatia, the Kirk terminal that recently started up, and is also the purpose of that was the Balkans wanted to have a resource base that was alternative to Russia, and that was prior to the current crisis. And then you also have, I think everyone has probably heard of the very aptly named FSRU Independence, the Klappeda terminal in Lithuania, which is enabling the Baltics to basically, completely reduce their reliance on Russian imported gas. And prior to the FSRU independence, they were 100% reliant on Russia as a gas provider. So, and those are cold places where people need to heat their homes. So that's not a great place to be. So essentially, a lot of countries are looking to have these sort of emergency measures. Let's hook up an FSRU really quickly. And I think that can probably happen. And I'm sure the EU will act in an appropriate manner to accelerate the regulatory process to get those projects hooked up.
Do those can you fiddle with the technical capacity on those? Are those something that you can, if they're not being, I'm sure they weren't being maxed out prior to prior probably 6 months ago, they weren't necessarily being maxed out, especially when the demand is low in the summer or something. But can you fiddle with the maxing out? Is there a way to push it? Or is it sort of, this is the nameplate capacity, this is what it can do, and we know what that is. So we can run these back of the envelope numbers really quick and say, okay, there's 40 out there. This is what's going to happen.
I'm not sure so much on the technical side for FSRUs. I will say that in looking at the numbers for, let's say, FSRU Independence, it is actually running at about half utilization based on the data that I can see from NSOG. But I'm sure they can lift those numbers. For context, Gate LNG, so everyone talks about TTF. That's the Dutch hub, and the Dutch terminal is the Gate LNG terminal. And that terminal has basically been operating at 100% utilization. Even prior to the crisis, that was at a very high utilization rate, but especially after the crisis, it's been basically at 100%. To the extent where actually you can see a discount in the delivered LNG price according to Platts into Europe versus TTF. And that is a signal that there's probably some bottlenecks in regas capacity in Northwest Europe, right? So if you look at the absolute numbers, you say like, oh, well, the utilization rate is about 85%. They can probably juice that a little bit. And that's probably true. But there's also those, pesky commercial and technical constraints that sometimes make looking at utilization rates in isolation misleading. So I do think that sort of bringing it all together, there are liquefaction bottlenecks in the sense that every plant in the world is producing as much LNG as it possibly can. You've had a lot of plant outages, which, going back to our previous conversation, the part of the run up in prices was not just demand growth, but was also supply outages. Places like Norway has not been operating. They had an explosion there that has put that plant out of operation. A lot of legacy plants have had declining feed gas stocks. So right now, total liquefaction capacity on a nameplate basis is operating at about 91% utilization across the entire world. And that's essentially 100% effective capacity. As you know, Europe is taking as much as LNG as they can possibly get their hands on. And in the case of the market right now, that's a zero-sum game, which means that they're going to have to divert LNG away from Asia, which we're already seeing in the March numbers. Asian LNG demand has decreased corresponding to an increase in LNG imports from Europe. And actually, I will amend my statement. LNG demand is not decreasing, but LNG trade is, right? There's a lot of unmet demand across the world at these prices, and there was last year too.
So the prices is a great point, and I do want to conclude this because we're breaking this into two. But I think that's a very good point that I would like to raise. The pricing is huge, right? Is that we know you've explained demand really well of this, or the nameplate. Here's our capacity. We're running at 91%. If you're not buying this in Asia, so I mean, yes, for certain countries have this locked in. We have locked in volumes and everything. But if you're not buying it, and I think there have been other podcasts and folks talking about this. I think the UN climate change folks are coming out with some stuff this week. Is that coal use is going to was quite high over the course of 21, I believe will be through the roof in 2022. And it's a reality is that it's stable, right? We dig it out of the ground, we can sit it above the ground, put it on train cars and we burn it and we get power. And so I think coal use is going to probably accelerate just the ability to have it. So where you have coal production and the ability to produce it and consume it, I think we're going to see that rise throughout Asia. And Russia does have a lot of coal, and Russia does actually still continue to export coal to Europe. So those volumes are going to move around. You're going to get a lot of those in Asia, and I think that's going to go up. So the points that these pinch points of where folks are not getting enough or have enough on the gas side is going to be, I think, to some extent filled with coal. The other thing I would say on Europe is really important is that it's just the prices to think about inflation. And I really do think, folks don't think we're headlong into a recession. It didn't, we were sort of there well before the war in Ukraine. And this is the sort of the catalyst, I think, for Europe from a severe inflationary standpoint of looking at inflation north of 7%. And these prices, I mean, when you're hearing these stories on BBC of what these consumers are paying to heat their homes for electricity. I was listening to a couple BBC podcasts on that they do their real story and they dive into a topic, and I was shocked that even the announcers have changed their tone and rhetoric on energy versus climate and everything. And I think they were talking about reducing their use and consumption of natural gas. And they said, well, one of the panelists had said, well, if everybody in Europe would just reduce their thermostat by 1 degree, we could reduce this. And the person on the podcast who's doing it, she was like, well, I think people have already, I mean, they literally have to, because the prices are so high that they're already turning down the thermostats. And I've mentioned this before, and I think I mentioned it to you, is that the European Central Bank was talking about, a lot of consumers in Europe, we're talking in the OECD and the developed world, not adequately heating their homes. This is well prior to Russia invading Ukraine, was not adequately heating their homes at the end of last year, even, and the beginning of this year, because prices were so high. And these are really serious of these energy prices. And now it's inflation across the board that, again, prior to the war in Ukraine, exacerbated by food and energy and everything, and metals and just cross-border and supply chain bottlenecks. But the having inflation and really high energy costs and not access to adequate energy supplies, and I think the short term disconnects and bottlenecks are really serious. I think the ability, as you've pointed out, the technical capacity of figuring this out fast and having folks that adapt to this and seeing where European policy is very adaptive. And again, I'm not criticizing or ridiculing folks on the policy front, but you're going to be quick and adaptive. And I do think the U.S., the administration needs to take a note when European countries, when the UK and Boris Johnson are saying, hey, we're going to rethink leasing and fracking in the United Kingdom. When you hear them saying that, this is game changing. I mean, these countries do have natural gas, and whether I know they hate it, I know they hate fossil fuels and they don't want it and they want to get off of it, but producing it at home and having that energy security, being to control how they produce it, being to control the methane emissions from it, being to having a humane molecule, all aspects of it, they could control the environmental footprint of it so much more. And the fact that you're actually, I think it's a long way off from the UK actually fracking. And, we know Germany has it. We know France has the Paris Basin. I mean, the ability to actually produce it, it's actually there. It's a long way off, but I'm sure there's plenty of American frackers and companies over here that would love to help them out and do it. But it's something just serious to think about, and just the fact that it was even uttered by Boris Johnson and talked about that's a serious shift in just the world of reality of that. We do have to. We had people and heating, just for heating, cooking, and I mean, hearing in Ukraine of literally using fires to melt snow to get water. I mean, that's been the life of thousands of people who haven't had electricity or any energy for quite some time. So this is gonna. I feel like we're gonna transition a bit as people tire of the news a little bit, which is gonna suck because they need to pay attention to what's going on in Ukraine. But as the war sort of lingers on and we come into the summer months and the weather gets better, I hope that people are still paying attention and understanding that when the winter comes, this is all going to be very, very present again. And so I imagine, to your point of all you're saying on these regulation change and these shifts over the course of the summer, it is gonna be tricky, because I don't think that we have France has an election coming up. I don't think we have a complete, yes, we're all in on energy security. I think and the way they're seeing renewables and climate, it's still, all this is pulling together, and it's going to be messy in terms of how this plays out, both from a near and sort of medium term perspective. And people do vote that way, and people are going to vote on the cost of living and things like that. So you're more than welcome. I think we've taken a lot of time from listeners. You've been a fantastic guest, and I know you probably have a couple comments from that, which I'm happy to hear before we close up.
Yeah, I guess I'll just close with two thoughts on what you just mentioned. One, your turning down the thermostat, I think, is yet another example of the magical can openers, and that again, reality bites, and we have to face what is currently happening. And two, your points about coal. I will share one fun fact. Even prior to the Ukraine crisis, we saw coal prices in Europe that were heat rate adjusted and then carbon price adjusted, right? So you've seen carbon prices in Europe hit all-time highs. And so when you include that in what the cost is to burn coal in the power stack, you actually saw coal was more expensive than burning oil in Europe and power at certain points. So it's just, everything is sort of topsy-turvy in the markets today. And I think we're in sort of the early innings on what all the implications are. And I think if I were to sort of summarize it all, everything we've talked about today tells me that the market is not saying it needs more LNG capacity. It is screaming that it needs more LNG capacity. And I think projects like ours are, prepared and ready to do so. And I think this is going to be a really interesting few years to come.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think that I don't think we're going to see these prices. I do think the market's going to respond. I think that, like I said years ago, I am, I was saying it all last year on the podcast, I am long nat gas all day long in terms of what the fundamentals of global demand and the global energy needs are going to need it. Prices are not sustainable at these levels, and they'll come down, and the market will respond to it. And I have a lot of confidence in that. I just think that it's all these near-term issues. But with that, you've truly been an awesome guest. I really appreciate your willing to interrupt, your willingness to push back and argue a bit. And I love that we don't fully agree on the China thing, which is totally fine, because I think that's a benefit to listeners and folks. So Renee, it's been a total pleasure. Tell Sharif that he is coming on the podcast, whether he likes it or not. He does a lot of them. So we'll get a very different perspective from him. But Renee, you've been awesome. You're a wealth of knowledge, and really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Trisha. It's been such a pleasure.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye. Bye.